series of the College of Engineering of the University of Texas at Arlington. I am J.P. Valvey, the Dean of Engineering, and it is my honor and privilege to host the distinguished speaker series. Today, our speakers, Cory Doctorow, resonate quite a lot with the College of Engineering. He's going to tell us about technology and all kinds of facets of technology, especially the human facets. Now, I'd like you to understand that engineering is all about people. Sometimes we think of engineering as things, but in the engineering is all about people. It's about putting the technology at the service of people. So you will see today, we will explore this human dimension of technology, sometimes dark aspects, sometimes brilliant aspects. Let me tell you a bit about Cory Doctorow. He was born in Toronto, Canada, and now lives in London, in the United Kingdom. He is a science fiction novelist, a blogger, and a technology activist. He is a co-editor of the popular weblog Wing Wing, wing.net. Easy to remember. He contributed to The Guardian, to the New York Times, the Publisher Weekly, Wired, and many other newspapers, magazines, and websites. He's the former director of European Affairs for the Electronic Frontier Foundation, F.org, a non-profit civil liberties group that defends freedom in technology, law policies, standards, and treaties. He is a visiting senior lecturer at Open University in the UK and a scholar in virtual residence at the University in Waterloo in Canada. In 2007, he served as a Fulbright scholar at the Annenberg Center for Public Diplomacy, which was located at my former institution, the University of Southern California. His novels have been translated in dozens of languages and are simultaneously published in hard copy and released on the internet. He won the Locus and Sunburns Awards. He has been nominated for the Hugo, Nebula, and British Science Fictions Award. His New York Times bestseller, Little Brother, was published in May 2008. And it's a follow-up for a previous novel, The Wind, which was published in 2010. His later short story collection is With a Little Help. In 2011, Tapion Books published a collection of his essays called Context, further selected essays on productivity, creativity, parenting, and politics in the 21st century. IDB published a collection of comic books inspired by his short fictions called Cory Doctorow's Futuristic Tales of the Here and Now. His latest novel is Makers. I think it's published in October 2009. It's great, big, beautiful tomorrow. It was published in 2011. So his work has been really getting awards. Little Brothers was nominated for the 2008 Hugo, Nebula, and Versus Office Awards. Here is one numerous stuff that I want to hear a story.
Don't worry about it.
founded the open source peer-to-peer software company Open Ola, which was sold to OpenText in 2003. He has been serving on advisory boards of many organizations, including Participatory Culture Foundation, the Make Up Brains Foundation, the Organization for Transformative Work, the Annenberg Center for the Study of the Online Communities, the Clarion Foundation, and the Glenn Gould Foundation. In 2007, Entertainment Weekly called him the William Gibson of his generation. He was also named one of Forbes magazine's 2007, 8, 9, 10 web celebrities, and one of the World Economic Forum Young Global Leaders for 2007. Now in 2008, February 3rd, more exactly, Cory becomes that. He named his little girl Poesie, Emmeline, Fibonacci, Nautilus, Taylor, Doctor. He explained to me each of these names. Poesie, poetry, Emmeline, Fibonacci, Nautilus. He will explain to you why. But he says something touched me. He said, this little girl, Poesie, Fibonacci, Taylor, Doctorow, is a marvel that puts all the words of technology and artifice to shame. Now, being the father of a little girl myself, which I call modestly Catherine Mary, I say that I fully agree with his comment. We have marveled here in our little girls, and it's really a pleasure to welcome Cory. But
cheers. Thank you, sir. Cheers. Hi, folks. So tonight I'm going to give you a little talk called What We Talk About When We Talk About Internet Regulation. And I'll start with my thesis, and it is this. There are only computers. What does that mean? Well, we used to have special purpose devices, but now we only have computers. We used to have cars, and now we have computers we ride in. We used to have airplanes, but a 747 is just a flying Solaris box connected to some SCADA controllers. We used to have phones, but now we have computers in our pockets. We used to have ballot boxes and voting machines, but now we have computers at our polling places. We used to have video game consoles that just did one thing, and now we have computers that are locked so that they only play video games. We used to have hearing aids, and now we have computers we insert into our bodies that put voices into our head depending on the software that they're running. We used to have pacemakers, but now we have computers that use their firmware to tell them when to make our heart beat. We used to have TVs, but now we just have computers that we put in the front of our living rooms. We used to have DVD players, but now it's so cheap that it's almost not worth it to make embedded logic that just does DVD players. You just take a stripped-down computer, connect it to an optical drive, and then connect it to the computer that we call the television. We used to have personal stereos, Walkmans, little LP players, and so on. Now we have computers that we put in our other pocket. We now have MRI machines, which are computers that peer inside our body. We used to have printers. Now we just have computers that are connected to other computers. And increasingly, we have 3D printers that are connected to other computers. We used to even think that there was such a thing as a robot. But of course, all a robot is a peripheral for a computer. Science fiction in its golden age. They say the golden age of science fiction is 12. But the real golden age of science fiction was really the 30s through the 50s. And in the golden age of science fiction, we heard an awful lot about electronic people and very little about electronic brains. And thus far, it seems like electronic people have come to very little, and electronic brains have come to be everything. Science fiction in its golden age. They say the golden age of science fiction is 12, but the real golden age of science fiction was really the 30s through the 50s. And in the golden age of science fiction, we heard an awful lot about electronic people and very little about electronic brains. And thus far, it seems like electronic people have come to very little, and electronic brains have come to be everything. And computers are on the internet. Now, we used to have specialized networks, and today there is only the internet. We used to have specialized transport layers, things like FidoNet, which was a way that people who ran community bulletin board systems with 1 or 2 phone lines could join them up by having one bulletin board call another bulletin board and exchange all the email that one group had sent to the other, and so on, passing it slowly around the world, and so that people on one continent could talk to another, all the while minimizing the long-distance phone bills. We had things like UUNet, whereby messages were stored and passed from one computer to another using a slightly more efficient system that had the backing of governments, academic institutions, and military contractors. And we used to have things like microwave backhaul relays that would squirt messages from one place to another at very high frequencies. And of course, many of those things or their analogs exist today, but they have all been subsumed into the internet. And to the extent that things like FidoNet exist today, they are just an application of the broader internet. We also only have the internet today in the sense of only having computers on the endpoints. So we used to have specialized networks with specialized terminals. Do you remember that once upon a time, we maintained an entirely separate set of network and hardware infrastructure for the sole purpose of sending smeary, low-resolution bitmaps to one another? Do you remember the fax? We had telexes. Telexes predate the fax, and they were like faxes, only even grimier and smaller and more mingy. And we don't maintain those either today. If you need to send a fax to someone, chances are you use a computer. And if they want to read your fax, chances are they use a computer. We also only have the internet in the sense that all of our devices are now on the internet. Even devices that aren't on the internet are on the internet, but they use human beings to relay the internet to them. So, for example, you may have a non-networked device, but when it stops working, your first area of recourse to figure out how to make it work again is to go to the internet and get a recipe that you translate from the screen to your eyes, to your brain, to your fingers, and move it to the other device via its keyboard. This is a very slow and inefficient way to get information from a remote server into a device that you're holding in your hand, but make no mistake, the message is being relayed from one machine to another just as surely as if a wire were connecting them. We used to think that we had computers that stood alone, but now we have computers that stand alone except for their USB ports. And a USB port turns out to be a slow, latent, not very efficient way to get enormous amounts of information from the internet into devices that we believe are not on the internet. Even my dishwasher turns out to be on the internet, but not in the sense of all of those goofy, futuristic scenarios that we've been hearing about for the last 20 years. Your refrigerator will be on the internet. It will phone the grocery store and tell you when it's out of food. Now, my dishwasher is on the internet because when it stopped working, the dishwasher repairman came out. He opened a laptop, connected it to our internet connection, downloaded the firmware for our dishwasher, took a tiny, bizarre LED out of his bag, connected it to his computer, aimed it at a tiny light sensor on the dishwasher, and proceeded to flash the firmware by means of a high-speed flickering LED. Assuming that your devices are not part of the internet is a bad idea. The Iranian government thought that its nuclear reactors weren't on the internet. It turned out that they were, by means of a very slow, circuitous route that resulted in the Stuxnet malware spreading from parts unknown, although widely suspected, into their nuclear control systems and shutting many of them down. Assuming that your device is not on the internet can be a terminal mistake. The fact that it has no wires nor a network interface is no guarantee that it's not connected to the internet. So there is only the internet, and computers are on it, and everything is made of computers. And this means that there is only policy. We used to think that there was such a thing as copyright policy. We used to think that there was such a thing as a regulation for the entertainment industry that stayed in the entertainment industry. Copyright was conceived of as an industrial regulation, modern copyright as we know it today. There's nothing wrong with regulating big, complicated industries. I often, as I contemplate the plummeting economy, wish that we had better regulation for the finance industry. But even though I wish we had regulation for the finance industry, I would not like that regulation very much if it meant that in addition to one bank loaning money to another and then having to tell the FEC about it by means of long and complicated forms, it also meant that if I took you out for lunch and spent $10 on it, I would have to send the same form to the FEC because we had effected another wealth transfer. We need regulation of industry that can tell the difference between industry and people. Copyright used to do that by figuring out whether or not you were making a copy, and if you were, it assumed that you were in the copyright industry. And that was because making a copy used to be hard. If you wanted to make a record, you needed a record factory. If you wanted to strike a new print of a film, you needed a film lab. If you wanted to copy a book, you needed a printing press, several people to operate it, and a building to keep it in. Copyright used copying the way a tank mine's detonation system uses its scale. So we have these things, anti-tank mines. Theoretically, they're safe enough you could put them in a kid's playground because they only detonate if you drive over them with a tank. They have a set of scales in them. If you're not a big, heavy vehicle, they ignore you. So copyright assumed that if you were making a copy, that you were sort of pulling along behind you $1 million record factory, and it was okay to regulate you as though you were part of the record industry. But it turns out that today, we make tanks as toys. It turns out that today we make copies reflexively, millions of them all the time, because the internet is made of copies and computers are made of copies. A computer that works well is a computer that is copying. An internet that works well is a network that is copying. We speak metaphorically of loading a page over the web, but you have never loaded a page from one server to another. You copied that page from one server to another, to another, to another, to your computer, leaving many copies on the way and making many copies when it arrived on your computer in all the various buffers, all the various caches. We speak of streaming instead of downloading, as though you could stream a video or stream a song without downloading the video or downloading the song. But there is only one way for you to have a song that is contained on some remote server be relayed to your computer and come out of its speakers, and that is for you first to make a copy of the song on your computer. We pretend that because we sometimes believe that the software that is receiving the copy of the song will throw it away, that the copy hasn't been made at all. Now we copy millions of times in ways that used to be done hundreds of times, and we copy using devices that cost pennies that used to cost millions. And so when we say if you are copying, you are in the industry, we're wrong, manifestly wrong. We have designed tank mines that have turned into land mines. We've designed tank mines that used to only detonate if you rolled over them with $1 million record factory, and now roll over them if you're a 12-year-old girl writing Harry Potter fan fiction, because we continue to stubbornly insist that if you are making a copy, you need to adhere to copyright. We stubbornly insist that if you are making a copy, you are part of the copying industry and not just a person using computers. The copyright industry has claimed, I think foolishly, that the way that its rules will remain legitimate is by expanding them to everyone who makes copies, rather than redefining what tests they use to determine whether or not it's time to apply copyright law. That doesn't mean that there shouldn't be any laws when we make copies. We have lots of rules about copying things. Here in the university, you've got plagiarism rules that have nothing to do with copyright. You could plagiarize Shakespeare. Shakespeare is well out of copyright, and it would still violate the rules of the university. We have lots of rules about culture and copying. We have rules about attributing. We have norms and so on. But they aren't the same rules that apply to giant companies when they are making money with one another and with other participants in the entertainment industry. The copyright industry made this assertion that its rules should expand to cover all forms of copying, and that necessarily took them into some very odd places. For one thing, it meant that the copyright industry had to start asserting that it should have a veto over the design of networks. Because if networks can't be designed to limit copies, then the ability to make copies will remain so easy that it can't be effectively policed. And that's why we got the Stop Online Piracy Act, which is just the latest of a series of fairly silly laws and is not the last of them. And you probably heard about it. The Stop Online Piracy Act, even if you weren't paying attention, you probably remember that there was one day you couldn't do your homework because Wikipedia was down. It was down because they wanted to protest the Stop Online Piracy Act. And the Stop Online Piracy Act is a complicated statute, but one area in which it was particularly odd was in the way that it asserted control over something called the domain name system. So domain name system is a fairly technical concept. I know this is an engineering school. I don't assume you're all inside. A copy, you are part of the copying industry and not just a person using computers. The copyright industry has claimed, I think foolishly, that the way that its rules will remain legitimate is by expanding them to everyone who makes copies, rather than redefining what tests they use to determine whether or not it's time to apply copyright law. That doesn't mean that there shouldn't be any laws when we make copies. We have lots of rules about copying things. Here in the university, you've got plagiarism rules that have nothing to do with copyright. You could plagiarize Shakespeare. Shakespeare is well out of copyright, and it would still violate the rules of the university. We have lots of rules about culture and copying. We have rules about attributing. We have norms and so on. But they aren't the same rules that apply to giant companies when they are making money with one another and with other participants in the entertainment industry. The copyright industry made this assertion that its rules should expand to cover all forms of copying, and that necessarily took them into some very odd places. For one thing, it meant that the copyright industry had to start asserting that it should have a veto over the design of networks. Because if networks can't be designed to limit copies, then the ability to make copies will remain so easy that it can't be effectively policed. And that's why we got the Stop Online Piracy Act, which is just the latest of a series of fairly silly laws and is not the last of them. And you probably heard about it. The Stop Online Piracy Act, even if you weren't paying attention, you probably remember that there was one day you couldn't do your homework because Wikipedia was down. It was down because they wanted to protest the Stop Online Piracy Act. And the Stop Online Piracy Act is a complicated statute, but one area in which it was particularly odd was in the way that it asserted control over something called the domain name system. So domain name system is a fairly technical concept. I know this is an engineering school. I don't assume you're all in software or network engineering. The domain name system is a little like something that converts the name of a place to its GPS coordinates. So you might know that you're going to the McDonald's on 5th Street, but you don't know what its latitude and longitude are. You need that to get there. The domain name system takes something like McDonald's on 5th Street or www.google.com and converts it to a number, 192.168.1.1. That's not the address for Google. Without it, we can't find servers. So one of the things the entertainment industry decided that they should be able to control is what DNS servers say about the location of places. They said that if it turns out that the McDonald's on 5th Street has copyright infringing Happy Meal toys, that when you type in McDonald's on 5th Street into your GPS, that rather than returning the address of McDonald's on 5th Street, it said 00, Greenwich Mean, nowhere. Now, on its face, doesn't seem like that crazy an idea, but it turns out to be a very crazy idea. Because once you start telling people we need to control the DNS, you need to also start passing laws to control what happens when people try to get around your control of the DNS. Because of course the jurisdiction of the entertainment industry is just America. there are DNS servers outside of America. You may ask those DNS servers, I'm looking for the McDonald's on 5th Street. Do you know a better address for them than 00? And they might tell you the answer. And so what the entertainment industry then said is it has to be illegal to make software that checks to see whether or not someone's playing shenanigans with your DNS. Because if you can check to see if someone's playing shenanigans with your DNS, then you might get to the McDonald's on 5th Street and it's infringing Happy Meal toys. So, you know who plays a lot of shenanigans with DNS? Crooks. If you've ever found yourself on a website that looked an awful lot like your bank's website, only it wasn't your bank's website, and somewhere in the address bar it even maybe had the address of your bank's website, and you were about to enter your password and you stopped yourself before your life savings could be cleaned out of your bank by some scuzzbag who was messing with the DNS, you know that crooks like to mess with the DNS. And not just garden variety crooks, some pretty ugly and evil folks like to do this. Governments of repressive Middle Eastern regimes, for example, like to play with the DNS to man-in-the-middle people's passwords and start finding out how they're logging into services like Facebook, and to use that to figure out who they should arrest, who they should detain, who they should torture, ultimately even who they should murder. Making DNS work is important. And all the tools we have to make DNS work involve, first and foremost, figuring out whether someone's playing shenanigans with your DNS, which SOPA prohibited. But it's not just networks that the entertainment industry needed to control if they were going to treat copying as an industrial activity and stop it from happening without permission. They also needed to control PCs. So back in 1995, Al Gore held some hearings called the National Information Infrastructure Hearings, or Information Superhighway Hearings. That was the world's least fortunate metaphor for the internet, and has thankfully died. And he said the federal government is open to entertaining proposals from all comers about things that we should do to make the internet, which has heretofore been a kind of military and governmental project, safe for civilian use, and ready to enter the stream of commerce and become part of our business reality. And a guy named Bruce Lehman, who was Clinton's copyright czar, ex-Microsoft lawyer, came by and said, I have a whole whack of awesome proposals for this. We should license every copy. We should license like every copy, like copies in RAM, that's a license. Copies in network buffers, another license. Kind of full employment for people who write and parse copyright treaties forever. You know, it would eventually mean expanding the pool of copyright lawyers to encompass every human being that ever lived. But is that necessarily a bad thing? Well, Al Gore thought it was, and he sent Bruce on his way. So Bruce left America, and he went to Geneva, to the World Intellectual Property Organization, a UN specialized agency that makes copyright treaties for the world. It has the same relationship to dumb copyright law that Mordor has to evil. And at WIPO, he found a very receptive audience. And in 1996, WIPO passed the WIPO Copyright Treaty that embodied many of his sillier proposals. That came back to America in 1998 with the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, which was passed and has since been the law of the land. And among the things that the DMCA says, the Digital Millennium Copyright Act of 1998 says, is that if someone takes some technical measure to put a lock on a file so that it is hard to copy, you are not allowed to remove that lock, even if you're not doing something illegal, even if the file belongs to you. They call this anti-circumvention. And it went a little further than that. They also said that if you figure out a flaw with a digital lock, you can't tell anyone about it. And if you figure out how a digital lock works, you can't tell anyone about it. And if you figure out how to get a file out from behind its digital lock, you certainly can't share it. So this turns out to be something of a veto over the design of computers, not just of networks, because after that, they started to say, if you want to put our music on your media, you need to let us put a digital lock on it. So, and after we've done that, it means that no one can unlock the digital lock, not even you, not even the people who own the computers, without falling afoul of the law. So How does that work? Well, before 1995, there were CDs, optical discs, and they didn't have digital locks on them, and even if they had, it would have been legal to break them. And breaking digital locks isn't hard. The key to the digital lock, after all, has to be stored on your computer. Otherwise, you can't unlock the file and listen to it or watch it. No one wants to pay money for a movie they can't watch. No one wants to pay money for an ebook they can't read. So you have to store the key on the computer. It's kind of like storing the key to the safe in the burglar's house. Even if you hide it really well, the burglar will eventually find it, and they did. I mean, generally speaking, digital locks, even today when it's illegal to break them, are broken in a day. You may remember AACS key. This was the key that unlocked HD DVD, a now dead format. A formidable young man who calls himself Mueslick64, so frightening he named himself after a breakfast cereal. One day decided he needed to remove the digital lock from a DVD HD disc. Now, he bought the disc. He wasn't a pirate. He just wanted to play it on an operating system that wasn't supported by DVD HD. And so he reckoned that somewhere in his computer's video RAM, when the file was playing, would be, or in his computer's RAM rather, when the movie was playing, would be the key. So he looked at, and the key he knew was 128 bits. So he looked at the first 128 bits of his RAM, and that wasn't the key. So he looked at the second one, 128 bits, and the third and fourth, and so on, like starting at 1, 2, 3, 4, going all the way through to his gig of RAM, which took about, I don't know, 2 seconds, and found the key. And published it. 128-bit number. There were 1 million copies of it in a week. They never put the genie back in the bottle. That was just DVD HD. It was a dying format anyway. Someone sent him an email and said, hey, Mueslick64, I've got the same problem as you do, but with Blu-ray. Could you solve the problem for me? And he said, well, I don't have a Blu-ray player. I don't know if I've ever seen a Blu-ray player. I certainly don't have any Blu-ray discs. But yeah, okay. How about this? You just put a Blu-ray disc in your computer, grab a copy of your RAM while it's playing and send it to me. And he did. And sort of like, do you remember in Sherlock Holmes, the books, not the new release movie, and there was a brother, Mycroft Holmes, who was much smarter than Sherlock, but he never left the house. He sat in a basement and solved all the mysteries from his basement just by reading the newspapers. Mueslick64 is the Mycroft Holmes of breaking DRM. Mueslick64 sat in his basement, someone sent him a file, and a few minutes later he popped out the Blu-ray key. So DRM is broken all the time, but it's illegal to tell people how to break DRM. It's certainly illegal to make businesses that can break DRM. And if you are going to implement DRM, there is a requirement universally as part of the DRM requirements that you build the device such that users can't modify it easily. It has to be designed to resist user modification. It's a little like saying, we've put some secret sauce in this windshield wiper fluid. And if you're going to stick it in your car, you've got to weld the hood shut, because we don't want anyone finding out about the secret sauce. Now, someone out there can de-weld a hood, but by and large, most people won't be able to de-weld their hood, and maybe the secret sauce in the windshield wiper fluid will last. So what that means is that the technical architectures of computers are being determined by people who don't make computers, don't sell computers, whose claim on computers is that computers might interact with their copyrighted works. It's like saying the guy who makes the record gets to tell you how to design the record player. It's an entirely novel idea driven by this unwillingness to reduce the scope of copyright as the ease of copying increased. Back in 2003, there was a legislative initiative from the entertainment industry called the broadcast flag. So in America, it's illegal to scramble television. It's broadcast television, because there are airwaves. We give them to entertainment companies to use on our behalf. The deal is, if you want to broadcast on our airwaves, you have to leave the broadcast unscrambled so that we can buy any equipment we want to watch it. And in exchange, you can make millions and millions and millions and millions and millions and millions and millions of dollars off of your commercials. That's the deal. But the entertainment industry didn't like this. And they saw HD broadcast coming. They saw the analog switch off coming. We've just had the analog switch off. Now there's only HD signals, only digital signals being broadcast in this country. And they decided they were going to do something about it. So they went to Congress. They found a guy named Billy Tozan from Louisiana. Guy now runs pharma, big lobby for pharmaceutical companies. But back then he was mostly shilling in Congress for the big entertainment companies. And Billy Tozan said, well, we can't possibly get you a rule that says that you're allowed to scramble TV. The FCC is not going to give us that. So what else have you got? And they said, we've got an idea. We're going to broadcast unscrambled television. We're going to have a bit in the stream, the video stream. And if that bit is set, then all the devices that receive the television signal have to pretend it's scrambled. It's kind of a silly idea. And if it was just a silly idea, that would be enough. But it was more than a silly idea because of the consequences of what it means to treat the video as though it's scrambled. What they meant was, if you build a device capable of receiving a digital television signal, or a device capable of sitting downstream from a receiver, a recorder, some other piece of equipment, that you would have to build it to take any video that came in and scramble it and keep it scrambled and not connect to any other device unless it also scrambled it and kept it scrambled. And that you would have to scramble it in a way that triggered this Digital Millennium Copyright Act anti-circumvention, so that opening the device and understanding what it did and telling people what you found there would be illegal. So this was pretty extraordinary for the movie industry to say we should have a veto over the design of TVs, but it was even more extraordinary because what's a TV? A computer. You can't possibly say we are going to control the design of TVs without at the same time saying we are going to control the design of computers. To say video cards that can be used to show TV programs on a digital receiver have to be designed to comply with this rule is to say all video cards have to comply with this rule. There aren't video cards that you plug into receivers and video cards you plug into computers. Receivers are computers. The video cards they talk to are computers' video cards. You can't say that the network card in this device that's a TV has to comply with this rule without saying all network cards have to comply with this rule. You can't say that the drive in this device, the bus, the motherboard, all of these things become part of the purview of the regulation. Fundamentally, the proposal to the FCC was that you guys should go from regulating radio emitters and radio receivers to every device in our country, including cars and airplanes, because you should regulate all the components of things that could go into a television. So this was very sweeping. The FCC actually did it. They passed the rule. But very shortly thereafter, a court in DC said, you got to be kidding me. You think you have jurisdiction to regulate computers? And said, no. So what does that all mean? Well, it means that instead of having a copyright policy as distinct from other kinds of policy, all copyright policy ends up being internet policy, and everything we do today is done on the internet with PCs. Everything we do today somehow involves the internet, and everything we do tomorrow will require the internet. So I live in London, in England, and our city, like yours here, is actually a collection of a bunch of smaller cities. It's a metro. And each of those smaller cities has its own local council. There's a city, a township in part of London called Hounslow. Hounslow is a very nice place, I'm told. It has local council, and the local council takes in money for things like permits to build sheds and pay parking tickets and register your wedding and all the rest of it. But like everywhere, they're under austerity, and one of the ways they're saving money is they've literally boarded up all the windows that you go to give them money. There is one way to give them money, and that's to use the internet. So what that means is that if you get a parking ticket, you need the internet. If you want to build a shed, you need the internet. If you want to register your wedding, you need the internet. So if you do something to the internet, you do something to people's ability to build sheds. You do something to people's ability to register to vote. You do something to people's ability to register their children's birth or register their marriages. My wife, Alice, she's just quit her job to do a startup, but before that, she was the Commissioner of Education for a public broadcaster in the UK called Channel 4. They're the Big Brother people. That's the thing everyone knows about Channel 4 here. And when she was there, she worked with government research on the impact of network technologies and computers on the families that public service broadcasters are required to serve, which is everyone, including the poorest and most vulnerable people in England. Well, some of the poorest and most vulnerable people in England live in the post-industrial north, towns up north that used to have coal mines, steel factories, and so on, where all of those jobs have left. They've gone since the WTO to China and other parts of the developing world, and where what has resulted is total economic collapse. So these are some of the poorest places in the country. And there's an enormous amount of people who live in subsidized government housing, what's called council houses. So one of these studies looked at two families in a council house, same block of flats, same apartment building, as similar as they could be, similar background, similar makeup, similar size, similar age. One family had the internet, the other family didn't. And they validated this across wide groups. The families that had the internet consistently had better nutrition. Their kids had better grades, more likely to go on to tertiary education. Parents had better jobs because you can do a job search beyond the places that you can walk to in a day. Think of how many places you can look at for work on the internet versus how many places you can look at wearing a shoe leather. They had better civic engagement. They were more involved with local government. They had better political engagement. They knew what was going on in the world. In fact, in every way, their lives were improved by having the internet. The corollary of that is, if you regulate the internet, you regulate all of those things too. And that means that there is only policy. We don't have copyright policy anymore. We don't have internet policy anymore. We just have policy. And lawmakers continue to pass laws as though there was such a thing as copyright policy, as though there was such a thing as internet policy. In France, New Zealand, and the United Kingdom where I live, we have passed laws called, colloquially called three strikes laws. In New Zealand it was called Bill 92A. In France it's called Hadopi. In Canada, or in the UK it was called the Digital Economy Act. And in Canada the local version is called Bill C11. But the way that three strikes laws work is they say that if an internet subscriber is accused of multiple acts of copyright infringement, we take away their internet access. So 3 strikes and you're out. 3 accusations and away you go. Now, there's a lot wrong with this. The first thing is that cutting off an internet subscriber doesn't cut off one person. Cutting off an internet subscriber cuts off a family. It's what the Geneva Convention calls collective punishment. Collective punishment being one of the things that the Geneva Convention bans. That's when you punish a whole group of people for one bad thing that one person did. Those of you who are young students here may remember elementary school, or possibly, if you're unlucky, even high school, in which nobody will get up from their desk and go to recess until the kid who put his gum under this desk stands up and owns up to it. That's collective punishment. And collective punishment is generally thought of as the hallmark of thugs and fools. And in the collective punishment regime created in these 3 strikes laws, if you happen to live in a house that someone nearby has used in a way that caused someone else somewhere in the world to complain 3 times that you were infringing copyright without coming to the standard of proof that someone would need to come to in a court of law, you and everyone else who lives in that house with you loses all the benefits that the internet delivers, loses access to that single wire that delivers freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of association, and access to tools, communities, education, nutrition, employment, and all of the other benefits that we see accruing to people who have the internet, and that increasingly only accrue to people who have the internet. Now, it's tempting to say that lawmakers pass these stupid laws because they are evil or clueless, or possibly evilly clueless. But I don't think that that's a very satisfying place to get to. For one thing, it's a counsel of despair. It implies that the world will only improve once lawmakers stop being evil and or clueless, and I think we have a long wait before that comes to pass. But I have another theory about this. I have another theory about what regulators do and don't understand. I don't think it's necessarily important that lawmakers understand all the areas they make laws about. Lawmakers, after all, get degrees in public policy and politics, not water and sanitation, not education, and so on. We don't elect the senator from the great state of children's health. We don't have a congressman from the 1st district of biochemical policy. Instead, what we have are lawmakers who are schooled theoretically in listening to expert testimony on all sides of an issue, weighing it in the balance, and figuring out what to do about it. And by and large, they do an okay job. Not always, and sometimes there are catastrophic failures, but the internet doesn't represent and the failure to regulate it doesn't represent a single time in which a lawmaker got it wrong. It represents a consistent set of failings that seem to arise from some systemic problem. And I have a theory about what that systemic problem is. And it's that there is a heuristic a rule of thumb that lawmakers use to figure out when is the time to pass a law, when it's time to make a regulation. That heuristic is, do we have a law that's likely to work? And if we pass this law, will it have lots of effects on things that have nothing to do with the law? Will it have lots of what economists call externalities? It's a very abstract idea, so I'll make it concrete. If I go to a lawmaker and I say, cars are awesome, but I've figured out through my careful study that people who talk on hands-free phones in cars are much more likely to get into accidents. The lawmaker might propose a law that says you can't put a hands-free phone in a car anymore. Now, you might disagree with the law. You might say my study methodology is flawed. You might say the removing hands-free phones won't work. You might say it's worth the risk to have hands-free phones and that this is an undue incursion of liberty on our liberty. But the one thing almost no one would say with a straight face is, if you take the hands-free phones out of the cars, they'll stop being cars. Because we understand that cars can have features added and subtracted to them without losing their essential carness. Now, on the other hand, if I came to the same body of lawmakers and I said, I've been studying the statistics on bank robberies, and it turns out that every bank robber drives a getaway car with 4 wheels. Can we remove the bank robbery feature from wheels? No lawmaker would take me seriously, because we don't know how to remove a feature from something general purpose. And when we try, you get kind of a travesty. I've tried to imagine what a bank robber-proof wheel is, and I think it's got a GPS and maybe a brake. And the GPS and the brake are maybe connected to the police radio. And if it senses a bank robbery, it applies the brake to all the cars near the bank robbery. And I think most of us would agree that this probably wouldn't work very well, and that it would also have lots of opportunity for mischief, and would make cars a lot more expensive, and would do finally fundamental disfiguring violence to the underlying utility of wheels, which after all are used for lots more things than bank robberies and cars. So we think of things as being suitable for regulation if they are complicated and special purpose. And we think of them as being unsuited for regulation if they are simple and general purpose. But computers and networks are a new thing. They are complicated and general purpose. They are complicated, but they do lots and lots of different things. So if you have a naive view of computers, if you haven't studied your computer science, if you don't know what phrases like Turing complete means, if you don't know what a von Neumann architecture is, then you may think of all the things that a computer can do as features in the same way that a hands-free phone is a feature. Your computer running a spreadsheet has a spreadsheet feature. Your computer running World of Warcraft has a multiplayer online role-playing game feature, and so on. And from there, it doesn't seem unreasonable at all to say, well, make me a computer that has no spreadsheet feature. Make me a computer that has no multiplayer game. It sounds like make me a car without a hands-free phone. And if you think of protocols and services on the network as features of the network, then saying, fix the internet for me so that it won't run BitTorrent anymore. Or fix the internet for me so that the piratebay.org doesn't resolve to an IP address anymore. Sounds like, I don't like the sound that a busy signal makes. Let's change which MP3 we play when you get a busy signal. Or that pizzeria on the corner isn't paying its phone bill. Let's disconnect them from the phone network. It doesn't sound like a fundamental attack on the principle of internetworking. So not realizing that the rule of thumb that works for cars and houses and every other substantial area of our technological regulation fails when it comes to the internet doesn't make our lawmakers clueless, and it doesn't make them ignorant. It just makes them part of the vast majority of the world to whom ideas like the end-to-end principle and general purpose Turing-complete computing are not particularly relevant subjects. So off regulators go and blithely pass their laws, and they become part of the reality of our technological world. Suddenly, we create numbers that you're not allowed to publish. When Muslix64 extracted the 128-bit key from DVD HD, the motion picture studios spent a good long while and an awful lot of money sending letters to people who had published this number, a number that you could read over the phone in a few seconds, a number that was known by then to millions of people, a number that they still maintained was a kind of trade secret in the very special definition of a secret, meaning something lots of people know that isn't a secret at all. Suddenly, all it takes to make legitimate material from the internet is to point at it and say, this infringes copyright, take it down, because our copyright laws streamline the process of removing material by imposing a burden on people who host copyrighted material to remove it on notice of an infringement. But it fails to attain the actual goal of the regulation. It doesn't actually stop people from violating copyright law. However, it bears a superficial kind of cargo cult resemblance to copyright enforcement. And so any failure that arises from this regulation is blamed on the idea that we haven't made the regulation go far enough, not the idea that the regulation itself is a flawed errand. So we just don't know how to build general purpose computers that can run every program that we can express in symbolic logic, every program that we compile, except for one program that pisses you off. The closest approximation we have to that computer is a computer that can run all the programs but has some spyware on it that tries to stop you from running the program that you're not supposed to. So that is to say, a computer on which remote parties can set binding policy without the computer operator's knowledge and over the objection of the computer operators, which means that anti-copying technology, digital rights management technology, always ends up converging on spyware, always ends up converging on malicious software. And on the network side, every attempt that we've made to make a network that can't be used for copyright infringement converges immediately with the surveillance and control measures that we know from repressive governments like China and Syria and so on. So the Stop Online Piracy Act banned tools for circumventing DNS blocks because you would use those to access websites that have been blocked in this country. It banned tools like Tor, the onion router, a project originated by the US Navy, and that is widely used by hundreds of thousands of people around the world to circumvent their nation's censoring firewalls and to avoid the surveillance of their secret police. And in fact, the people who promoted SOPA, the Motion Picture Association of America, one of the studies they cited to argue that SOPA would work was a study that said that SOPA used the same measures as those used in Syria, China, and Uzbekistan. And in Syria, China, and Uzbekistan, there was some effectiveness to these technologies. And so if they worked there, they'd work here. They said, we need the Uzbeki internet in America. And one thing that gets lost in this discussion when we talk about URL blocking, censorship, controlling what people can see over the network to make sure they're not looking at something naughty, something they shouldn't be, is that in the physical world, we can distinguish between censorship and surveillance. We can say it is illegal to sell James Joyce's Ulysses in bookstores without knowing all the things that people read. I don't agree with saying you can't sell James Joyce's Ulysses in bookstores, but it's been done, and when it was done, it didn't make the government any wiser to everything else people were reading. But if you say no one on this network is allowed to visit www.jamesjoycesulysses.com, you have to look at every URL that is requested on the network to stop them seeing the URL that's been prohibited. And so we no longer have censorship. We only have surveillance that is entailed by censorship. So rootkits, censorship, and surveillance are the place where policy debates about the possible and actual ills of the internet always ends up. So back when Joe Lieberman was very upset about WikiLeaks, the response that he came up with was to call up Amazon and get them to remove WikiLeaks' hosting, to basically say to them, if you continue to host WikiLeaks, something very bad will happen to you. We don't know exactly what he said. I've heard lots of informed theories from people on the inside, and the best theory I've heard, the one that sounds the most plausible, is that Joe Lieberman called up Amazon and said, you know, you've got this data kind of smeared out across millions of computers in your cloud storage, cloud computing grid, and those have got millions of drives and so on. And no one knows forensically how to go in there and make sure that we've got all the WikiLeaks data just by pulling one hard drive. So I think if we needed to investigate whether or not WikiLeaks and you were complicit, we'd have to take all of it. So maybe you just want to get rid of them so that we don't have to do that. And I think that's more or less what happened. In Sweden, they were justly worried about child porn on the internet. I worry about child porn on the internet. I've got a 4-year-old daughter, and child porn on the internet is the stuff of my nightmares. So Sweden decided to solve it with a national firewall. So they erected this national firewall. And it's funny, you know, I said the MPAA said the national firewall in China works. They're wrong. The national firewall in China doesn't work. And the national firewall in China doesn't work in some of the most extraordinary circumstances we can imagine. I mean, China has more engineers than any other country on earth. Most of the network equipment that we use is made in China. And there's no rule of law. There's no idea that a court might say, I'm sorry, this is cruel and unusual punishment. And so you can ascribe any punishment you want to any crime, up to and including, if you violate this law, we'll harvest your organs and give them to party members. And China has completely failed to build an effective firewall. Nevertheless, lots of people keep returning there, including the Swedish government, the Danish government, which built a child porn filter that would have that would look at all the URLs you are visiting and try and stop you from visiting the bad ones. Now, countries have tried this. Canada tried it, UK tried it. And one of the things that they say is it will work. It will stop people from looking at bad stuff. But even so, we can't tell you what URLs are being blocked, because if we did, it would kind of be a roadmap, like a phone book, to find all the child porn. And when you say, well, yeah, but your firewall would block me, right? And it works, they say, yeah, but better safe than sorry. We can't tell you what's in the censoring list. So if you've got a system into which bureaucrats can add URLs that they don't want you to visit, and that you're not allowed to visit, and they're silently discarded when your browser requests them, and if they don't have to tell anyone what URLs are being put in that firewall, it's a pretty good bet that some stuff that's merely distasteful or that is inconvenient will end up in that firewall. So a lot of people in Sweden and Denmark thought that that might be the case, but they were widely dismissed. You know, oh, you're just being paranoid, you free speech absolutists, go back to America. And then WikiLeaks, someone leaked them the list of what was in the child porn filter in Sweden and Denmark. 98.5% of it wasn't child porn. After the London riots, my Prime Minister, David Cameron, although I didn't vote for him, I'll hasten to add, said, we need to start establishing mechanisms to shut down Facebook and Twitter in the event that another riot breaks out to stop this from spreading. Now, none of these things would work. And even the stuff that most of us will agree that we don't like, child porn and terrorism, it still doesn't work on them. You can't fight these problems with censorship and spying. In the information civil liberties world, we for a long time have talked about the 4 horsemen of the infopocalypse. That's pornographers, the mafia, pirates, and I'm missing one. The mafia, pirates, terrorists. Thank you. And the idea is that you could get anything done if you just said we're trying to fight one of those 4 groups of people. But those 4 groups of people can and do routinely figure out how to circumvent censorship and spying. And so you end up in a world in which people who are motivated and crooked get around the censorship and the spying, and the rest of us are living with censorship and spying. And moreover, you will end up in a world in which the remedy that's used to solve that problem is to increase the ease with which censorship and spying can take place so that maybe we can catch the criminals. So, for example, a guy named Jacob Appelbaum, who's one of the people who works on both WikiLeaks and Tor, visited something called the Wiretappers Ball. This is a trade show for companies that make surveillance equipment for governments and police forces to use on their network. They're supposedly in the intelligence business, but they didn't notice that Jacob had bought a ticket. And until he showed up in a suit looking pretty straight and walked around and just collected product literature for a couple hours, at which point they figured out who he was and asked him to leave. But the product literature that Jacob took out was published by a newspaper in the United Kingdom called The Independent and detailed what these lawful interception technologies do. And what they do is pretty scary. The first technology Jacob found was something that impersonates an iTunes update. So you put it on the, at the network data center for your target. It waits for their computer to request an iTunes update. It sends something back that looks like an iTunes update, except it's not. It's a rootkit that takes over their computer and allows for remote operation of the camera, the microphone, to log the keystrokes, to read the screen, and to look at all the files on the hard drive. Then there were more variations on this, one for the iPhone, one for Android, kind of a cross-platform malicious software world. And much of this stuff relies on certificates, cryptographic certificates being issued at government or industry request without any, that are wrong, that are bogus. So it involves weakening the certificate system that we use to validate www.yourbank.com is really your bank. Well, one of the consequences of having a weak system for validating certificates is that people who want to play shenanigans with secure communications find it easier to do so, even if they're crooks. We know that a Dutch certificate authority had a bunch of its certificates stolen either by an independent hacker who just happened to be Iranian or a guy working for the government of Iran, depending on who you believe. We're not sure what his official role was vis-a-vis the Iranian government. We do know that the Iranian government used that certificate to intercept communications with Facebook, Hotmail, Google, Gmail, and so on, and to figure out which of its dissidents should be rounded up, tortured, murdered, and so on. We live in a world where in the name of fighting these bad guys, of fighting these things that you may or may not agree are harmful, some of which I think are harmful, some of which I think are overstated, we are building spying backdoors into all of our networks. We are designing our devices to hide what they're doing from us and to take orders from remote parties. And these facilities can be used by good or bad guys alike. Computers have the power to magnify our freedom, and they have the power to magnify tyranny. If you want to keep computers safe for freedom, and if you want to use them to fight tyranny, you need to get involved in this. Engineers are on the front line of this war. There's an American company that hires engineering graduates, just like you folks will be in a year or two, called Greencoat. Greencoat's network appliance does deep packet inspection to figure out what people are doing on the internet. That deep packet inspection has found its way into despotic Middle Eastern regimes, and we know of people who've been kidnapped, tortured, and murdered as a result of information gleaned from Greencoat. You can build technology that helps governments murder dissidents, or you can build technology for liberation. You can work on technologies like Tor. You can work on technologies that help people remain anonymous and secure on the internet. You can get involved. Organizations like the Electronic Frontier Foundation, Engineers Without Borders, Tor, Fight for the Future, who organize the anti-SOPA protests, Students for a Free Culture, a global network of campus student organizations that fight for a fair and open internet, and the Creative Commons, all deserve your support. And I hope that you'll consider finding ways that your special expertise can be a part of making the future a place that we all want to inhabit. Thank you.